In 1965, a man walked into his company's break room for the last time after 40 years. His coworkers were waiting. There was cake, there were handshakes, and there was a small box with a gold watch inside. He knew exactly what came next. A pension check every month for the rest of his life, guaranteed. No worry, no uncertainty, just security. That's what retirement looked like. And it's almost impossible to imagine today. Let me tell you what that ceremony actually looked like. Because if you weren't there, you might think it was just a formality, but it meant everything. The company would schedule it for a Friday afternoon, last hour of the last day. They'd gather everyone in the break room or the meeting room. Management would be there. The foreman, your crew, guys you'd worked alongside for decades. Some of them had started the same year you did. Some were younger, watching what their future looked like. If you retired in the 60s, you remember this. If your father or grandfather did, you heard the stories. The manager would stand up, give a speech, talk about your 40 years of service. 40 years. Let that sink in for a moment. He'd talk about the first day you walked through those doors in 1925. Young, strong, ready to work. How you'd been there through the Depression, through the war, through strikes and layoffs and good years and bad years. How you'd raised a family on the wages from this company. How you'd been loyal. And then he'd present the watch. But before we get to what that watch meant, you need to understand something about 1965 that made it different from any other time. 40 years at one company wasn't unusual in 1965. It was normal, expected. That's just what people did. You got hired at 18 or 20. You learned the job, you did your work, you stayed. The company kept you on. You kept showing up. Year after year, decade after decade. 40 years later, you retired. If your grandfather worked at the steel mill or the auto plant or the railroad, this was his life. One job, one company, start to finish. But here's what people today don't understand. This wasn't just about loyalty. It was a deal. You gave the company 40 years of your life. Your strength, your time, your youth. You showed up every day. You did the work. You didn't complain. You were loyal. And in return, the company made you a promise. An actual, binding promise. Work for us until you're 65, and we'll take care of you for the rest of your life. That promise had a name. Pension. And in 1965, that promise was real, not a maybe, not a hope, real. A pension wasn't like a 401k. It wasn't money you saved yourself and hoped would be enough. It was guaranteed income, every month for the rest of your life. No matter how long you lived, the company calculated it based on your years of service and your final salary. Let's say you'd worked 40 years, and your final salary was about $6,000 a year. That was decent money for a factory worker in 1965. Your pension might be $250 or $300 per month, sometimes more if it was a good union contract. If you remember getting those pension checks, you know what I'm talking about. That check came every single month like clockwork. But here's what made it different from anything today. You didn't have to manage investments. You didn't have to worry about the stock market. You didn't have to calculate whether you had enough saved. The company handled all of that. They put money in the pension fund, they invested it, they managed it. Your only job was to cash the check every month. And that check kept coming, whether you lived to 70 or 95. The company couldn't take it away, couldn't reduce it, couldn't tell you the money ran out. It was yours. You'd earned it. 40 years of loyalty bought you security for life. And in 1965, something else happened that changed retirement forever. July 30th, 1965, President Johnson signed Medicare into law. For the first time in American history, people over 65 had guaranteed health insurance. You might not realize how revolutionary this was. Before Medicare, if you got sick after you retired, you paid out of pocket. All of it. A hospital stay could bankrupt you. A serious illness could wipe out everything you'd saved. Medical costs were the single biggest fear for retired people. Families would drain their savings taking care of sick elderly parents, or elderly parents would refuse treatment they needed because they didn't want to burden their children with the cost. If you remember life before Medicare, you remember that fear, the terror of getting sick when you couldn't afford care. Medicare eliminated that fear. Suddenly, when you turned 65, you had health insurance, real coverage. Hospital stays were covered. Doctor visits, most of the costs that used to destroy families financially. Combined with your pension and Social Security, Medicare made retirement actually possible. You could stop working, You could rest. You could live without fear that one illness would destroy everything. But you still needed to know, how far did that pension money actually go? Let's talk real numbers, because $300 a month sounds like nothing today, but in 1965, it was enough. Your house was paid off. So that $300 pension, plus maybe $100 or $150 in Social Security, gave you $400 to $450 a month for 2 people. No housing payment. Groceries for 2 people ran about $80 or $90 a month. Utilities maybe $20. Property taxes depended on where you lived, but maybe $30 a month if you budgeted for it. Car insurance, gas, incidentals. If you lived on a pension in the 60s, you remember doing this math, every month making it work. And here's the thing, it did work. You weren't rich. You couldn't take expensive vacations or buy new cars every few years, but you could live comfortably without fear, which is why the retirement party felt like a celebration. Not an ending, a beginning. Back to that break room. The manager had just presented the gold watch. Everyone applauded. You held that watch in your hands, solid, heavy, real gold. Your name engraved on the back. If you got one of these watches, you kept it forever. Maybe you wore it. Maybe you put it in a drawer and took it out sometimes to remember, but you kept it. Then came the handshakes. Every man in that room came up to shake your hand. Some of them had worked with you for 20 years, 30 years. They knew your kids' names, they'd been to your house for barbecues, you'd been to theirs. This wasn't just coworkers, this was community. And there was something else happening in that moment that nobody said out loud. You were showing them what they had to look forward to. You'd made it 40 years. You'd survived the layoffs that got other guys. You'd avoided the injuries that ended some careers. You'd stayed healthy enough and lucky enough to make it all the way to retirement. And now you got to rest, got to enjoy what you'd worked for, got to live the promise that had kept you coming back day after day for 4 decades. But before you could really enjoy retirement, there was one thing you absolutely had to have, and most people had it. The paid-off house was everything. Without that, retirement didn't work. Most people who retired in 1965 had bought their house in the late 40s or early 50s, right after the war. The GI Bill made home loans available with no money down. Low interest rates, 30-year mortgages. You bought a small house in a working-class neighborhood for $8,000 or $9,000, or maybe $12,000 if you were in a bigger city. Your mortgage payment was maybe $60 or $70 a month. You paid it every month for 20 or 25 years. If you grew up in one of these houses, you remember, small, 3 bedrooms maybe, 1 bathroom. Single-car garage if you were lucky, nothing fancy, but solid, well-built yours, and by the time you retired, that house was completely paid off. No mortgage payment meant your pension could cover everything else. You didn't need much income because your biggest expense was gone. That house was your security, your stability, the foundation that made retirement possible. Some people sold those houses when they retired, took the equity, and moved somewhere cheaper, somewhere warmer. Which brings us to a phenomenon that defined 1960s retirement. But before we talk about moving, let's talk about what retirement actually meant day to day. Because for most people, it meant one thing more than anything else: time. For 40 years, you'd worked 6 days a week for most of those years. Long hours, hard labor, you saw your kids before work and after work, and on Sundays, you were tired most of the time. You fell asleep in your chair after dinner. But now you had time. If your grandfather retired in the 60s, you might remember him differently than your parents do. Your parents remember him always working, always tired. You remember him having time, being around, being present. And here's what people don't talk about enough. Retirement in 1965 meant being a grandparent, really being one, not just seeing the grandkids on holidays, but being part of their lives. You could babysit when your daughter needed help. You could take your grandson fishing on a Tuesday afternoon. You could be at the baseball games and the school plays. You had time to teach them things, to tell them stories, to build things with them. This was the life you'd worked 40 years to earn. And for many people, there was one more dream. In the 1960s, retiring to Florida became the American dream. Sell the house up north, buy a small place in Florida. Live in the sun, no more snow, no more cold winters, just warmth and palm trees and golf, if that was your thing. It started in the 50s, but exploded in the 60s. Developers built entire retirement communities. Small houses, affordable, designed for retired people. Places like St. Petersburg, Fort Lauderdale, Sarasota. If you had relatives who retired to Florida in the 60s or 70s, you remember visiting them. The strange flat landscape, the heat, the retirement communities where everyone was the same age, everyone retired, everyone living the same life. But here's why it worked. You could sell your house up north for maybe $15,000 or $18,000, buy a smaller place in Florida for $12,000, put the difference in savings. Your pension and Social Security covered your living expenses in Florida just as easily as they would have up north. Maybe easier because utilities were cheaper in a smaller house, and you got warmth, you got sunshine, you got a community of other retired people who were all doing the same thing you were. This was retirement. This was what 40 years of loyalty bought you. Security, time, freedom, comfort. But it didn't last. The retirement that was possible in 1965 started disappearing in the 1980s. Companies stopped offering pensions. They switched to 401 kiloseconds, shifted the risk from the company to the worker, told people to save for their own retirement, and hoped the stock market cooperated. Healthcare costs exploded. Even with Medicare, the out-of-pocket expenses became crushing. Long-term care, prescription drugs, things Medicare didn't cover fully or at all. Houses got more expensive. The idea of paying off a house in 20 years became impossible for many people. 30-year mortgages stretched into their 60s. People retired with mortgage debt. If you retired after 1990, you know this. Retirement was different, harder, less secure, more stressful. And here's what really changed. In 1965, retirement was a reward, something you earned, something the company owed you for decades of loyalty, something that was guaranteed. Today, retirement is a gamble, something you save for yourself and hope you saved enough, something that depends on the stock market and healthcare costs, and living long enough to enjoy it, but not so long that you run out of money. The deal broke. The promise was forgotten. And the retirement that was possible in 1965 became almost impossible 50 years later. That's what retirement looked like in 1965. The gold watch after 40 years at one company. The pension check that came every month for the rest of your life. Medicare that covered your health. Social Security that supplemented the pension. A paid-off house that eliminated your biggest expense. Time with grandchildren, maybe a move to Florida. Security, dignity, rest after decades of labor. If you retired in the 60s or 70s, you lived this. You remember the ceremony, the watch, the first pension check, the relief of knowing you were taken care of. If you're younger, this probably sounds impossible. 40 years at one company, a guaranteed pension, retiring at 65, and actually stopping work. That world doesn't exist anymore for most people, but it did exist for one generation, maybe two. It was real. It was the deal. Work hard for 40 years, and we'll take care of you for the rest of your life. That man who walked into the break room in 1965 for his retirement party knew he'd de-earned his security. He'd kept his end of the deal. The company kept theirs. He got his gold watch, his pension, his time. That was retirement in the golden years. That was the promise of the American workplace. That was what loyalty and hard work bought you. And for everyone who lived it, you know how good it was. How much security mattered, how much that guarantee meant. That's what we lost when pensions disappeared. Not just money, but certainty, security, the knowledge that decades of work would be rewarded with dignity in old age. That was 1965. That was retirement. That was the deal that built the middle class and gave millions of working people the golden years they de-earned. It's gone now, but for those who remember, it was real, and it was good.